Hello wonderful people! Today we're going to be drawing a really cool, super simple mountain with a night sky and some nice evergreens. And all you need to follow along this video is your favorite digital art software. I will be using Procreate, as well as just a very simple, basic round brush. So we're going to jump straight into it today. We're going to start by creating a gradient for the background sky. Now, depending on the software you're using, you might have an automatic gradient tool, in which case you could go ahead and use that. But if you're working with Procreate, we're going to just do it by layering or drawing the basic shapes and then adding a blur. So no matter which software you're using, go ahead and just create a new layer and rename that new layer to gradient. And this tutorial is entirely customizable, meaning you can draw your own composition and you can completely change the color palette to make the final illustration your own. That being said, to make it easier for you to follow along if you want to do exactly what I am doing, go ahead and check out the video description below, because there you'll be able to find the color palette I will be using, and it is completely free of course, so feel free to pause the video here, go ahead and download that, and then come back when you're ready. So essentially here, again, we're going to create a gradient using these four colors, or at least they're the ones that I'm going to use. You could go with a different color scheme. So I'm going with something that is kind of purple with a little bit of pink and orange. But you could just as easily start with a dark color and then go more towards blue and green if you want to. So I will give you tips on how to do that along the way. But all of us, we're going to start with a super dark color for now that we're going to drop over the canvas, and then we're going to start creating the gradient. So if you are working with the color palette, the color we're going to use for that dark color is this one right here at the top of the column on the left. So as you can see, it is kind of a blue-purple that is really quite dark and quite saturated as well. So you can just take that and drop that onto your canvas to fill it in. Now from there, we're going to start layering the other colors as I mentioned. And to do that, if you have a gradient tool, again, just go ahead and create a gradient with your gradient tool. If you don't have one, or if you're not sure how to use yours, don't worry. We can just go ahead and select any base round brush that we have in our software. So in the case of Procreate, that would mean opening the brush menu here, picking the airbrushing pack that comes with the app, and just selecting the hard brush. Now the size here does not matter because we're just mapping out basic big shapes, but the opacity of the brush does matter. So make sure your opacity is at 100%. And if you're working with Procreate, the opacity slider is this one right here, so just make sure it is at the very top. Now from there, we're going to draw a slight curve, I would say roughly 2/3 or 3/4 of the way up in our composition. And this color is the one that you can easily customize. So again, I'm going with something purple and pink, but if you wanted, you could go with more of a blue, more of a green, an orange, whatever you want. If you are working with the color palette, the one I will be picking is right under the blue, or the dark blue that we just used, this purple right here. And as you can see, it is still quite saturated, so there's not a lot of gray in the color. It's a very vibrant color, but this time it is quite a bit lighter. So if you're working with a different color, I would recommend trying to keep the saturation similar and the darkness similar as well, but you could just go with a different hue. So again, a blue, an orange, whatever. And then we're just going to draw the U on the top of the piece as I mentioned. Then once you have that, just go ahead and fill in this section by dropping in your color. Now if you're working in Procreate, you're probably going to need to adjust the threshold when you do that, which is super easy. Just keep your pencil on the screen and then move it towards the left until it only fills the desired section. So we're going to repeat this step with probably 2 or 3 other colors to create a gradient. So again, I want to have a purple pink, so this time I'm going with something a little bit lighter and a little bit more saturated, more towards the pink than the purple, which in the color palette is going to be this one right here. Again, as you can see, it's still quite saturated, but much brighter. And then same thing, we're just going to draw a U shape, but this time obviously a little bit lower, so we have a gap between the two colors. And then we're going to repeat one last time, this time with a really bright color. So in the color palette, if you're following along with me, we're going to pick this one right here. As you can see, it is fully bright, so no black at all, just a bunch of white. And this time I'm going with more of a orange-red type of color. Great, so from there we're just going to add a very simple blur to create the gradient. Any kind of blur you have available to you would work well, but if you do have something called Gaussian blur, this is what I personally would recommend. So if you are working with Procreate, the blurs are in the adjustment panel here at the top, so the little magic wand icon right here. In the second section here, you can see at the top we have Gaussian blur, so we're just going to tap on that. And then to add blur, all you have to do is take either your pencil or your finger and swipe it towards the right. And to reduce the blur, just swipe back towards the left. So here the amount of blur is totally up to you. You can just experiment. You don't want it to be so blurry that it just looks like this kind of weird gray in the middle, but you want to make sure that you don't see the absolute separation between the different shapes either. So something in the middle, I'm going to go with 47. So feel free to pause the video here if you need more time to rework your gradient. Otherwise, we're going to move on to adding, well, I guess it's an optional step. So we're going to move on, if you want, to adding a bit of a frame around the piece. Otherwise, you could just keep it open. What I mean by a frame is I want my little landscape to be in a circle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new layer above the gradient, and I'm going to rename that new layer to frame. Now, I personally want this frame to be really super dark, but you could go with a white, a gray, whatever you want. So I'm personally going to pick, it's going to be really hard to see in the color palette because it looks just like the background, but trust me, there's a square right here on the top right. So it's an even darker version, essentially, of the darker color I used in my background. And then with that, I'm going to draw a circle. And then I'm going to fill in the edges to create that frame. Now you could have a completely different shape if you want. I just think a circle is pretty simple, pretty nice, but you could have a rectangle, you could have kind of a more organic shape. That is something that you can really easily change to customize your piece. Now if you do want to draw a circle, and if you're working in Procreate, there's a really cool trick that we can use to make it super easy. And the trick is just draw a very wobbly circle at first. And then hold your pencil on the screen, which is going to create a smooth ellipse. And then if you want a circle and not an ellipse, just bring in another finger and tap on the screen with that finger as well. And then if you move the pencil, you can very easily resize the circle as desired. So I'm going to go with something like this, but it is really not in the middle of the piece. So if that's the case for you as well, which it probably is because it's pretty hard to get it right in the middle, just go ahead and grab any kind of arrow tool you have and reposition the circle where you want it to be. Now it doesn't need to be right in the middle, but something a little bit better than what I did at least. And from there you can just fill in the edges to create the frame. So now that we have this frame and the sky, we're going to start mapping out the shapes of the mountains, and it's going to be super, super simple. Now the main thing to keep in mind when drawing these elements or mapping out the base shape of these elements is the color scheme that we're going for, or how to adjust the color scheme, I should say. So no matter which color you want to use here, a blue, a green, an orange, a purple in my case, the one thing to remember is the further away an element is, so the further back it is, the paler and the dirtier the color is going to look. So you're going to add more gray and more white in the color. And inversely, the closer an element is to us, the darker and the more vibrant the color is going to be. So again, that means you can easily customize the piece by changing the base hue, so green, blue, red, orange, whatever you want, but just remembering those tips as we go and how to change that base color. So we're going to start by mapping out the mountains the furthest away in the back, which in my case is going to be the biggest mountain range, or like the highest peak, I guess. And so for that, go ahead and create a new layer, put it between the frame and the gradient, and rename that new layer to Mountains 1. Now here, if you want, you can keep your base round brush or whatever other brush you like. Honestly, it doesn't matter at all here. Or you could work with a selection tool instead. Now in this case here, I'm going to go with a selection tool because I find it is a little bit quicker because I'm not as crazy about drawing specific shapes as I would be with a brush. I'm a little bit more loose, and I think the result looks better because of that. So again, if you don't want to use the selection tool, just stick with the same brush. Otherwise, go ahead and pick whatever selection tool you have in your software. In Procreate, it is this kind of S icon right here at the top. And here, make sure it is set to freehand so that you can draw whatever. It doesn't stick to like a rectangle or something. And then with that tool, you're going to do just like you would do with a brush, meaning you're going to draw the line of that mountain. It can be, again, whatever you want. Probably just focus it towards a little bit lower than the middle of your frame. So I'm going to go here with some wobbly mountains on the sides that then get taller and bigger towards the middle of the piece and then fall back towards the right as well. So again, very quick, as you can see. It's not a very precise shape in any way, but that does look like a mountain range, so that's enough for me. One thing though here, make sure you come back around, so following roughly the frame, and close your selection around so you have a closed shape. And here we're going to pick, as I mentioned, just a lighter or light gray version of our base color. So as I mentioned, I'm going with something that is purple in my piece. So I'm going to pick essentially a light gray purple, which in the color palette is this one right here. So you can see roughly middle of the way in terms of the saturation and a little bit more than middle of the way in terms of brightness. So you just use those parameters or roughly those parameters if you're working with a different color. Again, the idea is just having something pale and gray in the back. And then once you have that color, very easy, you can just drop it in your selection to fill in the shape. Now, once you have that, you might notice that your sky, the gradient, is not exactly how you want it to be. That is totally normal. We can easily adjust it. So just go back on your gradient layer and then use any transformation tool you have to just squish it and adjust it as desired. So in Procreate, I'm just going to pick the arrow tool right here at the top. And I'm going to set it to freeform or distort. Honestly, both could work well here, just so that I have the option to squish the piece, or squish the sky at least. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. In my case, I feel like I couldn't see as much of the bottom part of the gradient as I wanted to, so I'm just going to lift the bottom up and maybe squish this. I'm not sure. Yeah, I think I'm just mostly going to lift the bottom up so that I can see a little bit more of that nice, like beige orange color. Great, so now that we adjusted our sky or a gradient, we're going to keep adding mountains layer. So just go ahead and create a new layer above mountains 1, but still below the frame, and rename that new layer to mountains 2. Same thing here, you could either use a paintbrush or the selection tool. I'm going to go back to the selection tool. And here we're going to draw another mountain range, which is going to be a little bit lower, of course, but also not as intense. I don't want more mountain peaks to compete with this one. I really want this one to be the focus of the piece. So this new mountain range, I'm just going to keep it, you know, uneven because they're still mountains, but not quite as uneven as this top one. Then again, closing the shape to close the selection, and going with another grayish version of our base color. So in the color palette, I'm going to pick this one right here, the second one in that purple column. And if you're following along closely, you're probably noticing right now, this one is actually lighter than the one that we use in the back, which kind of goes against what I mentioned earlier of you want the elements that are further away to be lighter and the ones that are closest to us to be darker. But the thing is, we're going to come back and add some extra highlights on the mountain in the very back, and so they're going to get even lighter than they are right now. Now, if that doesn't make sense for now, don't worry about it. You're going to understand in just a few steps. But for now, we're just going to pick, again, a light gray version of our base color. And then we're going to repeat at least one more time to create another mountain range, but this mountain range is going to be significantly closer to us. So we're going to start seeing a lot more details within it. That could be like big trees poking out or something like that. So go ahead and create a new layer above mountains 2, but still below frame, of course, and rename that new layer to mountains 3. Again, just using either a brush or a selection tool, whatever you want, and drawing another mountain range that this time has a lot more wiggles in the outline. closing the shape, and then this time coming in with a significantly darker, more saturated version of your base color. So in the color palette, we're going to pick the third one in this purple row, which, as you can see now, is quite a bit darker and quite a bit more saturated. And we're just going to fill in our shape. And if at any point you feel like you're not super happy with a range, it's so easy to just tweak it, either using the eraser, a paintbrush, or just coming back in with the selection tool and changing something. I feel like I went a little bit too strongly with the wiggles here. So I'm just going to come back in and try to see if adding this extra shape that is slightly less wiggly would actually look better, which I think it does. Oh yeah, definitely. Great. Now we're going to repeat this step one more time, but this time this mountain range is going to be so close to us that we're not going to see mountains, but we're going to start seeing trees. So go ahead and create a new layer, again, above mountains tree, but below frame, and rename that new layer to Trees 1. So on this Trees 1 layer, we're going to use, again, just a darker, more saturated version of our base color. You must be sick of hearing me say it by now. In the color palette, it is this one right here on the right of the main purple column that we've been using. It might be a bit hard to see, but again, trust me, it is right there. And it is quite a bit darker than the one we just used. Now here, you could, if you want, just stick with the selection tool method and draw the trees, but I like to use a paintbrush for this because I feel it allows me to have a little bit more control over the actual branches, which is not a bad thing in this case. It could be a bad thing for the mountain range, but I think the trees, it's worth just taking a little bit more time to work on them. So here, again, you could just stick with a base round brush that could totally work well, or you could try to find in your software a brush that is still a solid brush, which means it doesn't have any texture, it doesn't have any kind of transparency effect to it, it's just a solid brush, but that might be a slightly different shape than just a circle. So if you have something that is oval, you could experiment with that. If you have more of a rectangle, you could experiment with that as well. It might help you create a little bit more organic shapes in your trees than if you were working with just a circle. That being said, if you only have a circle, that's not a problem at all, just stick with that. I personally will be using a brush from my inking, stippling, and texture bundle. It is not essential at all though. If you do want to check it out, it is linked in the description below, and there's always a special promo code for YouTube people. But again, this brush is really just a personal preference here. Experiment with what you have in your software. If you don't want to experiment, that's fine as well. Just stick with a base round brush. Again, though, I personally will be using a brush from that bundle, if I can find it. There we go. And that brush is called the Ultra Smooth Tracing, which, again, is just a solid brush. As you can see, no texture, no gradient, no transparency, but it has a bit more of an organic shape. And here we're going to start with a very similar technique, but we're going to draw very intense points instead of kind of a mountain range shape. So set the brush to whatever size you're comfortable with. It's not a one-size-fits-all at all here. As long as you're able to draw the base shapes, that's all that matters. And then just go in and draw these big triangles. Now make sure you change the size of the triangles. So you want to have some tall ones, some short ones, some wide ones, some narrow ones. Really just experiment with a bunch of different things here. And then once you have that big outline mapped out, we're going to close the shape. So you're just going to start on the side or one side, draw under your frame to close the shape so that you can then come back in and fill it in. Great, and from there we are going to stick with our paintbrush no matter which brush you're using, and we're going to zoom in so that we can add details on the trees. Now we don't want to add too many details though, because we're going to have another layer with really precise trees right in front of this one, but we do want to make it look less like just these weird, base triangle shapes. So I'm going to give you an example really quickly. You're going to see it's quite easy. All we're going to do here is we're just going to start from that base shape and add extra little branches poking out. So you can just start by mapping out the main branches on both sides, and then just coming back in and adding some extra little funky branches to make it look a little bit fuller. But again, there's no right or wrong way to do this here. You definitely don't want to spend too much time on this. It's really just a question of adding a little bit more detail, but when we zoom out, we're not going to see every single little detail anyway. So don't agonize over this at all. And I'm going to stop talking to let you focus on drawing these details, but I'm going to keep my video going in the background if you want to use it as a reference as you go. That being said, again, don't agonize over the details. Don't spend more than 5 minutes on this. It is really not that important. And with that, it is time for the secret password. So if you've watched this far in the video, please go ahead and leave me a comment below letting me know which color you're using for your piece. In my case, the main color would be a purple. Now, if you're a little bit confused with what is the secret password thing, it's a game that we play here on the channel. In all the long-form illustration videos, I hide a secret password or a question like this one for you to find and then leave in the comments below. And that does a few things, the main one being that, believe it or not, it gives me a lot of insight into how to edit and pace my videos better, which helps me create better tutorials for you. So once more, if you watch this far, just let me know which main color you're using for your piece, and then we're going to keep going. So feel free to pause the video here if you need a little bit more time to work on these trees. Again, it shouldn't take too long, so don't spend more than, again, 5 minutes or something like that. And once you're done with that, we're going to move on to adding some extra little elements to make the piece look good. So adding some light on these back mountains, some stars, and some even more detailed trees in the front. Awesome! So here we're going to start by just adding a bit more details on these back mountains before we keep going, because right now the piece doesn't make a whole lot of sense, again, because these mountains are quite a bit darker than the rest. So what we're going to do here is going to be using essentially the same technique that we use to color block the base shapes, so either a paintbrush or a selection tool, but this time we're only going to select one side of the mountain. So go ahead and create a new layer above Mountain 1 but below Mountain 2, and rename that new layer to Lights. And here, if you want, you can just color pick the base color you used for this back mountain and make it quite a bit brighter. Or if you're working with the color palette, we're going to pick this really dusty purple right here in the color palette, which is just above this kind of white. And making sure we are on the light layer, going back to either a paintbrush or selection tool, we are going to draw first the edge of this mountainside. It doesn't need to be the exact same edge, as long as it's roughly there. That's all that matters, really. And then when you come back into close the selection, this is where you're going to add the extra shapes to start carving the mountain range. So I'm going to add this kind of weird triangle here. And then here I'm going to draw this almost zigzag shape with some little extra zigzags within the main zigzag. So just kind of like this. Big points, nothing precise at all. And then bringing it right to the top to close the shape. And then just like for the rest, we're just going to fill it in. And you can always adjust it as needed, either by coming back in with the selection tool and adding extra shapes, using, for example, your paintbrush if there are some weird overlaps that you want to tweak. But again, this is not something you should need to spend a whole lot of time with. This whole illustration is really just about basic rough shapes. Now, once you do have this main big one, we might also add some extra little triangles on the left side, which the general left side would be more in the shadows, so there's not as much light, but there might be some mountain peaks that are peaking above enough to receive some light. So again, section tool, paintbrush, whatever you want, just drawing some extra little squiggly triangles. Again, nothing precise, just something roughly like that. If you are enjoying the tutorial so far, please consider giving the video a like and subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Now, I know everyone on YouTube is asking you to do that, but believe it or not, it is a fantastic way to support your favorite creators because it tells YouTube to take the video and show it to more people. So thanks for helping. And then once you do have the base shapes mapped out, feel free to go back and just play with the opacity of that layer. I feel like my highlights right now are way too pale, they're just too intense. So I'm just going to lower the opacity of that light layer so that I can see some of that base mountain color behind the lights. So in Procreate, the way to change the opacity, super easy. You can just tap on the little N, that's the check mark on the layer. And then you're going to see the opacity slider right here, so you can just lower that as desired. There's, again, no right or wrong answer here. I would recommend, though, making sure the lights are paler than the second mountain range. So I'm going to set mine around 60. Now, once you have that, we're going to move on to adding some very simple stars in the background just to make the sky a little bit more interesting. So go ahead and create a new layer below all the mountains you have, but above the background, and rename that new layer to stars. And here you have a bunch of different options on how you're going to draw the stars. You could just stick with your basic paintbrush and just draw a bunch of dots. You could use something like a snow or rain brush that you know you like. In this case here, I'm going to use a free brush that I created for this tutorial, which is Star Dots. So once more, feel free to pause the video and go ahead and download that if you haven't already. Otherwise, if you don't feel like getting a bunch of freebies, no problem at all. Again, just stick with any base brush you were using and just draw a bunch of dots. If you do have my freebies bundle though, we're going to pick the nature pack that comes with it, and we're going to select the Star Dots brush. And here for the color, we're just going to go with pure white, so super easy in the color palette. I added it right here, so you can just go ahead and select that. And then really all you have to do is test the size of your brush. Mine actually looks pretty good, so I'm going to keep it as is, but just do a few tests and then come in and draw some stars wherever you want. And just like we did for the light on the mountain, feel free to go back once you've drawn your stars and change the opacity of the layers so that they maybe blend a little bit more with what we have in the background. So just playing with the opacity slider. And you could also play with what is called blending modes. Now, blending modes are usually with the opacity of your layers. So if you're working, for example, in Photoshop, they're right underneath. Same thing with Procreate. It's a list with a bunch of weird names, and you can just scroll through the list and see how the colors react. Essentially, blending modes are just taking the color on a layer and blending them with the colors underneath, meaning you're going to get a bit more color variation than just, playing with the opacity. So here, again, no right or wrong answer. You can just scroll through the list and see if there's something that you prefer more than just the normal option. Now, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense because now these stars are purple, but I think it looks nice. So I'm going to actually use overlay as my blending mode, but again, feel free to use whatever you like here. Now we're also going to add, if you want, some shooting stars. So just go ahead and create a new layer right above the stars layer we just have, or just created, and rename that new layer to shooting stars. And here we're going to use, again, just the white that we've been using, but we're going to go back to the base brush, not a star brush. So either just a round brush or any other brush that you've been using so far. In my case, I was using from my Inking, Stippling, and Texture bundle the Ultra Smooth Tracing. And we're just going to draw 2 or 3 slightly diagonal lines. So just like this. And then we're going to thicken the left side of these lines. Now I feel like mine don't exactly look the best. This one is a little bit too low for my liking. It's a little bit too big. So I'm just going to draw a selection around it. And then I'm going to go back to my distorting tool, so Arrow tool right here in Procreate. And I'm going to move it a little bit closer to the first one. And also maybe just distort it a little bit so it's smaller. And thinner. Yeah, that looks fine. Now from there, we only have 2 things left to do, but they're completely going to transform the piece. The first one is we're going to add some atmosphere between the mountains to help add a bit of that mystical, magical feel. And the last thing we're going to do is we're going to add some very precise trees in the foreground that are going to be, in my case at least, the same color as the frame. So it's going to just make the piece, the composition, a little bit more interesting, but it's also going to help frame that mountain here in the back. That being said though, again, we're going to start by adding some atmosphere, and the way to do that is super easy. We're just going to create a layer between Mountain 2 and any lights you have, essentially between the mountain range. And you're going to rename that layer to Atmosphere. Still with the white, this time going back to a selection tool, we're going to draw a line just a little bit above that second mountain range we have. So it doesn't need to be the same shape, but just a little bit higher than it. And then we're going to again close the selection so that we can fill it in with our white. Now right now it looks absolutely crazy, I'm going to give it to you, but we're going to use the same technique that we use in the background to create a gradient. So we're going to add a little bit of blur, and then we're going to play with the opacity to make it look like this kind of mist or clouds at the bottom of this big mountain range. So starting with the blur, again, any kind of blur you have in your software, I'm going to go with Gaussian blur, which is right here in the adjustment panel. Gaussian blur here. And once more, this is a case of just trusting your judgment. You don't want something that just looks like, you know, the whole piece is blurry now. You want something softer than harsh, but not too soft either. So I'm going to go with around 40%. And then once you have that atmosphere, feel free to go back and play with the opacity so it blends in a little bit better with the piece. Again, this is something you can just use your judgment for. I'm probably going to go with something around 80%. And then from there, we're also going to add the atmosphere between the other mountain ranges we have, but we can just duplicate or create a copy of this layer that we already created. So to do that in Procreate, it's super easy. Just swipe your finger towards the left, or just swipe the layer towards the left with one finger, and then select Duplicate. And then drag the new copy between Mountain 2 and Mountains 3. And then from there, we're just going to lower the layer a little bit so that the atmosphere is at a different height. So just use any kind of selection tool you have, or any kind of adjustment tool you have, I should say, and just drag the layer towards the bottom. Now we're also going to lower the opacity even more so that we have less and less intense mist as we come closer to the front. So I was at 80 here. I'm currently going to go around 60 or 50, somewhere in that range. And then we're going to repeat once more, so just creating a copy of that atmosphere to go between Mountains 3 and the Trees 1. So swiping the layer towards the left with one finger, selecting Duplicate, putting the atmosphere where we want it to be in the layer list, and then just dragging it towards the bottom a little bit. and lowering the opacity once more. So here I'm probably going to go around 25 or something like that. And speaking of, lowering the layer, at this stage, when we have the main composition mapped out, you always have the option to just move the different layers we have. For example, I feel like my trees one are a little bit too high. I can barely see Mountains tree. So I'm just going to select my trees one layer and lower them a little bit. So feel free to pause the video here, move the different layers you have as needed, if needed. Otherwise, we're going to jump straight into the final step, which is going to be drawing some very precise trees in the front. So these trees should be the darkest version of your base color, so in my case, a really dark purple. If you started with a dark frame, I recommend drawing these trees the same color as the dark frame, so it looks like the frame is actually, blending in the trees and just, again, makes the composition a little bit more interesting. So go ahead and create a new layer and rename that new layer to Trees 2. As I mentioned here, I'm personally going to go with the same color as the frame, so I'm just going to color pick that. Otherwise, if you have like a white frame or something like that, just color pick the color you used for Trees 1 and then make that even darker than it was. And here's same brush as we've been using, so either a base round brush, a different kind of solid brush that has a different shape, or if you're working with my bundle, the Ultra Smooth Tracing. What we're going to do is we're going to start by just mapping out the height of the different trees. And here you probably want to go with nothing more than 3 trees so that you can frame, again, this back mountain without taking away from it. So we want to keep these trees really on the edges. So I'm going to go with a tall one here, a shorter one here, and a medium one here. And we're essentially going to use the same strategy as we did for these trees that were a little bit more precise than just the mountain range, but we're going to go even further than that. So we're going to add even more little branches poking out, and we're going to have them be a little bit more random. So they're not just all going to, kind of like what I did, face downwards. Some of them are going to poke outwards, upwards. Really, we're going to have a lot of different shapes, but we're going to still, as pine trees would usually look like, we're going to still have clusters of branches. So you can start by mapping those clusters first. Some longer ones, some shorter ones. And then you're going to come back in, and throughout the entire height of the tree, you're going to add these extra little branches. So when they're not clusters, these branches are going to be pretty short and focused on the trunk. But when they're around the clusters, you're going to get some big, long branches that, again, don't have to necessarily follow the exact same curvature. You can have some that poke right upwards, some that pokes downward, some short ones, some long one, but really just filling up the cluster to make it look like, the big branches that you see on pine trees. Now there are some stamp brush that you could use. I know a lot of creators have some of those in their bundles, either freebies or stuff like that, but this is a how to draw tutorial, so I want to show you how you could go ahead and draw them. That being said, if you do have any stamp brush, feel free to go ahead and use it at this stage. You're going to save some time, but it's not going to be an original piece anymore because you are using someone else's drawing. So just keep that in mind. But if you are more conscious about the speed than anything else, go ahead and feel free to use any stamp brush that you might have. I do not have a specific recommendation for that, but if you do have some, feel free to leave them in the comments, honestly. Even if they're from a different creators. Well, they would be from a different creators because I don't have them, but yeah, I'm just rambling at this point. So once more, I'm going to stop talking here to let you focus on drawing your trees, but once more, I'm going to keep my video going in the background so you can use it as a reference, of course. If you enjoyed this video and want more landscape and backgrounds tutorial, I highly recommend you check out this playlist because I have a bunch more for you. But before we leave, make sure to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Then click on the link right here and I'll meet you there.